Okay, well, welcome everybody to today's Employer of Choice session. So this one is on the topic of creating a diverse and inclusive workplace. And this particular topic is something that's very dear to me. It's something that I'm passionate about learning more about and trying to use this platform that we have at One Nucleus to be able to share some amazing stories and knowledge. So yeah, I'm so pleased to have such a fantastic panel with us today, and I hope you enjoy the session. This session is being recorded, as you may have noticed, and a link will be made available after the session, and also the slides that are going to be used. So yeah, that's it from me. I'm going to hand you over to Jay Sloan, and he's going to introduce himself and our panel, and I hope you enjoy the session.
Thanks, Jazz. And if you go to the next slide too, it's going to show you a picture of who we are and our names. And as Jazz mentioned, I'm Jay. My pronouns are actually they, them. I identify as non-binary. Also use the words queer and gay just to describe myself. I'm the current co-chair of the Proud Science Alliance, and I'm here in that capacity today to facilitate the conversation. And I'm also a consultant and executive coach myself, but I'm going to turn over to Anne. Anne, I think your camera got turned around, so we can't see your face. But if you, there you go. Yeah, why don't you do a quick introduction? And come off mute, and then there you go.
Sorry about that, Jay. Can you hear me, and can you see the real person instead of the background of the sitting guilds from where I'm sitting? Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm Anne Lim. I'm chair of the Innovation Corridor, which is the corridor that runs from London to Cambridge, and pleased to say that we work with One Nucleus. Delighted that we're taking part in this event with you, and it's all credit to One Nucleus for setting it up. I call myself pansexual these days. I'm capable of falling in love with men and women, but I'm a woman, and I've lived with my wife for 35 years, and she is now my wife because we were able to get married. Thank you.
Amazing, thanks, Anne. So, Soreya, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me and asking me to be part of the panel today. I feel really humbled and privileged to be part of this conversation. My role is actually looking after everything people related at Enara Bio, which is a cell therapy immuno-oncology organisation based down in Oxford. And a real kind of, I guess, focus for my role is making sure that we do create that diverse, inclusive organisation where people can thrive and feel that psychological safety to show up as they truly are, and as their authentic selves. And I think of myself as an ally, and I use the she her pronouns.
Amazing, thank you. And finally, Dom.
Hi, thank you very much for the invite to be here. I'm actually a physicist, so I feel like an interloper, but a really lovely type of interloper. So thank you for the invite. And I'm the head of public engagement at UCL. So kind of in my day job, I kind of look after democratizing research and teaching at the university. And it's an honor to kind of do these sort of things as well, kind of as part of my what I call the gay job. So I'm a gay man. I use he/they pronouns. And yeah, and kind of my partner is a man as well, and he's also a physicist, but I didn't know that when I got together with him. I only found out afterwards, but I don't hold it against him really. But it's an honor to be here.
Amazing, thanks. So we're going to hear from all of us here in just a few minutes, but before we get started, Jazz, if you want to go to the next slide, we wanted to start with just some foundational information. And one of the things that I always like to share up front, when in particular working with organizations who start talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, is sometimes the attitude that I run up against. And all of the work that I've done in inclusion is that, oh, that DEI stuff, belongs to HR, or it's somebody else's kind of role. But in fact, it's very integral to the business that we all are a part of, regardless of what kind of organization we're part of. And so I'm going to share some information, starting with a report that was put out by Boston Consulting Group in 2017. And what they talked about is that diversity not just matters, but it pays in innovation and in performance. And so if you look at the data here, this is just one of the data points that they call out in the report, and it's linked just like a lot of the other stuff that you're going to see here in the slides, so you can go in and kind of dive a bit deeper. But essentially, companies that have above average diversity scores in their management teams. So that's one indicator of an organization being serious about diversity and also inclusion, is that the products and services they launched within the last 3 years account for almost half of their revenue. Whereas companies who are less diverse, it's only about a quarter, so, and that's just one measure of innovation. What's interesting about this from my perspective is sometimes you go in your mind to this idea of, well, yeah, that's just, is that a real true measure, performance? And there's something that they describe as EBIT or EBIT margins. I did a bit of research and I'm not sure I completely understand it, except to say this, is that it's a measure of performance. And what they found is that those same companies that have above average diversity also were better performing overall. So it's not just about innovation, it's all about performance. If we go to the next slide, we'll kind of dive then into how queer people, LGBTQ plus people in particular, are impacted by exclusion. Because this is important, and I think one of the attitudes that I also run up against is that, well, we live in a country like the UK where this doesn't really exist, kind of exclusion or anything like that, which isn't necessarily true. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some research that hopefully you'll appreciate. The first is some really interesting data work that was done by Dr. Ming. Dr. Ming is a woman of transgender experience. I've actually heard her speak and met her, and she's phenomenal. She's a theoretical neuroscientist based out of California. She did her research her studying at Stanford. But what she works with is really large data sets, for example, LinkedIn and those kinds of things. Through all of that data work, what she found is that there is an implicit and quantifiable cost to being different. And she translates that into something called a tax. So if you think about it in those terms, because that's a really easy way to think about it, so if you're different, what does it really cost you over the course of your lifetime? One of the things that, one of those areas is really if you are a gay man in the UK, the cost of being different in that sense is $70,000 over your lifetime, which if you think about it relative to the other, kind of data points that she talks about and the implicit quantifiable cost of being different in different dimensions, it doesn't seem like that much. But imagine in your organization, every 10th man that comes in saying, I'm gonna take away $5,000 for the next 14 years of your pay for no other reason, except that you're different, so there is that sense, and I that made it real for me, because I was like, well, hang on a minute, that's not right. But just by being different, you have this tax or a cost of being different. The other research that I really like and point to a lot is the work that was done by Kenji Yoshino, and he's actually a lawyer that works out of NYU, and I think he studied at Yale. But he's written and talks very openly about the implications of showing up as your authentic self and their negative implications. So in today's world, I think, because I mentioned before, there's this attitude that, well, there's not really a problem here. That's often the case, that I didn't show up at the companies where I've worked and people didn't call me names. There wasn't kind of overt discrimination or exclusion, let's say, but I've experienced it in different ways. And I think how that shows up then is that you get the message that in order to fit in here, in order to get promoted, in order to be seen as somebody who is a leader, then you need to fit into these boxes. And oftentimes those boxes are kind of predicated on the straight, white, cisgender male norm. And so if you don't fit those, then what happens? And a lot of times what happens is that people modify their behaviors. It's something called covering. So some of you on the call here today might resonate with that. So if you show up to work, you might kind of think, well, I need to be more conservative, or maybe I don't want to wear that kind of jewelry or that kind of dress or hairstyle. Or for gay people, queer people like me, it's like, I need to butch it up. It's kind of what people I've said before. And in my case, I'm like, that's impossible. I don't know how to do that. So I've experienced those implications, I would say, both from trying to kind of downplay who I am, but also not being able to do that. So those are a couple of pieces of research that I wanted to point out. The next one, though, is very specific to the sciences. And if we go to the next slide, this is a study that was done by Nature, and it was published just over a year ago. And it was the largest ever survey that really focused around LGBTQ+ scientists. And there, you can read the bullets there yourself, but I think I wanted to point out a couple of things, because it does, it makes sense that there's, some kind of harassment and things like that you would expect. The thing that struck home to me is the first one there, is that 20% of the scientists they surveyed were more likely to have experienced some kind of professional devaluation. That means because people know or experience you as queer or as part of the LGBT+ community, they think less of your abilities, and I was like, hang on a minute. And in fact, I feel like I've experienced that in my lifetime, and just because of the way people perceive me or how I show up at work. And I was like, that really kind of struck me, at least. The other important thing to notice is that there's health implications, so there's a couple of instances listed there of how being treated differently at work and kind of experience these sorts of things have impact around sleeping, but also things like depression. But the thing I want to leave you with is the final bullet there, is that the implications or the impact of that is more scientists who identify as LGBTQ+ in this particular study had intention to leave science, and when you think about the importance of the work that we tend to do, the focus around innovation and that sort of thing, then of course we don't want people from this community to think about leaving science because they don't feel welcome. So with all of that in mind, our foundation, I also want to mention a lot of the great work that is happening and the progress that we are making. I know through the Proud Science Alliance and the work that we're doing that there's a lot that we can highlight, but I wanted to make sure that you understood that it's not all a rosy picture, that there's work that still needs to be done. And that's kind of the foundation of our conversation today. Check we're doing on time, right on time, I think, because that's all that I wanted to share, I think. But let's go to the next slide just to make sure. There wasn't, yeah. So what we wanted to do now is, obviously we could probably spend the next hour or 2 hours or whatever talking about all the data, all the information, that sort of thing. But a lot of times what helps is just to bring it to life through stories. And so that's what we're going to try and do today. And that's why we have all of us on the panel today. So we'll kind of share our experiences and insights, and hopefully that will be helpful. And for the first question, I'm actually going to come to Anne. And from your own experience and vantage point, why should LGBTQ+ inclusion matter to organizations like those who are represented on this call today?
Well, look, thanks, Jay. There are a number of answers to that question, aren't there? And when you see the research that you've just presented us with, it makes a very compelling case, I think, to anybody, whether it's about the bottom line or it's doing the morally right thing, or it's just about honouring the unique and precious individual that each one of us is. So to some extent, and I think it's fabulous, the research you've shown, the case is there. I suppose what we don't do enough of, and that's why it's good to reach people through sessions like this, but we don't do enough of sharing this practice and our stories and our experience across companies and with government and in communities to keep making the case. I think there's a real danger that perhaps people just feel, oh, well, we live in a more liberal society now in the UK. I can't speak for other places, but in my lifetime, things have changed massively for the better. But perhaps people think maybe job's done. Well, it clearly isn't. So that's my answer, Jay. It isn't done. We need more of this, and we need to help those who might not find this so compelling, might not feel safe, might feel threatened by this, companies who don't think it's even important because they're so focused on creating a brand new product that's going to be life-changing and world-changing, you know, like a vaccination. We need to get the space in to them and tell these stories.
Yeah, really good points there. And I'm going to come to Dom next and just ask you to build on what Anne has brought in.
Yeah, well, you know, I think in particular with life and medical sciences, you're doing research and kind of work which, you know, is essentially part of a global community. You know, it's kind of doing things that will benefit humanity and humankind. And to not have a full representation of what it is to be human in your workforce means you may not be able to kind of actually deliver to kind of particular groups. You know, there's always kind of lots of, you know, evidence that kind of shows that, you know, sort of medical treatments and stuff are skewed towards the white man and stuff, because that's kind of the ones that kind of mostly tend to dominate and stuff. And it's true for all sorts of characteristics as well. You need to have a fully representative workforce to kind of like understand what it is to be human. And kind of, and I think in, like I said, the life and medical sciences, I think that's key. It's in the name of it as well. You know, that's on top of kind of all the bits that Anne mentioned about being able to be happy and thriving in the workplace. You know, I think just from the science perspective, you know, like sort of the science is only as good as kind of what you're doing and kind of who you're sharing it with and who you're kind of involving in the process as well. So, you know, definitely. So that's coming with definitely with my engagement happen as well.
Yes, no, exactly. And then finally, Soreya, what would you add?
I think, you know, to talk to Anne's point around the innovation piece, just think of the loss of innovation that we would lose by, you know, excluding particular groups and the LGBTQ plus community. You know, as Dom said, you know, these diseases and illnesses don't discriminate. And, you know, if we want to continue pushing innovation, we've got to engage everyone in order to solve these, you know, diseases. And I think, you know, to Anne's point as well, the work will not be done until we see less of those statistics that you brought up, or those statistics don't exist anymore. And, you know, I think we talk a lot about the war on talent and how hard it is to find talent. Well, actually, the talent is all around you. And if you're turning a blind eye to particular groups, then you lose innovation. You'll continue to fight for talent. And, you know, we've got to address that, I think.
Yeah, some really, really solid points, and just a couple of things that I'll pick up on before we move to the next question, I think. But this one around talent, since you just mentioned it, I think is really important, you know, because I have been speaking with a few younger people, and through my inclusion work, it's always that part of the conversation where there's a certain expectation, you know, and I'll give you a very specific example. I was talking to a young non-binary scientist in the United States who has a completely different mindset from somebody that's older like me, you know, because I kind of put up with stuff because I was like, that's the way things are, you know. I didn't really think it would change. However, they were really keen to say, look, my expectation coming into work is that in fact, the kind of leadership that they were talking about and that they advocated for was more of an activist kind of leadership. Leaders who are saying, let's change the world, let's, you know, not let's deliver all these to the markets and things like that. But part of that is this expectation that they can show up to work just as they are. And some of the worry when things switched back from a more pandemic mindset and working at home to going to the office, and how they were like, well, I dress kind of androgynously. How are people going to react to me when I show up at work? Because they were relatively new into their career, you know, didn't have that experience yet. So I think that the focus on talent is really important. And the other thing I'd bring in is that I've been part of discussions over the last few months with this kind of cross US UK policy group that's sponsored by the governments, and it's really about innovation and science. So it speaks to this idea of innovation. And through their work, they identified 2 areas where innovation could be improved. Interestingly, one of them is around LGBTQ plus inclusion. You know, so the conversations I was contributing to was to understand, you know, what are companies, big corporates, you know, doing. Other people contributed from an academic perspective, you know, like, what does it feel like? What does it look like? What are the expectations? That sort of thing. And their report should help define, you know, not just the state of things, but also how do we need to improve it? So it's not just fringe groups or, you know, activists that are thinking about these things. It's kind of mainstream. So with that in mind, and certainly bring in any other responses, I think as we come into the next question. But as always is the case, you know, I think what happens is helpful sometimes to bring things to life is to make it personal. And around the table, we all have our own experiences, or we can share stories. And so that's what we're going to do next. And I wonder, Dom, if I could come to you first, and
Yeah, sure.
wonder if you can just share a personal story about when you felt included or excluded, or both, and because of your identity, and what is the impact it had on you?
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. There was an interesting stage of my life where I was working in industry as an engineer. So I kind of graduated from my first degree. And so I was 22, very young, and just come out as well, like sort of previously. So it's kind of very fresh and sort of, you know, still thinking around ideas around my identity. You know, I still am now, many years later, a decade later, you know. And I kind of basically ended up working in a transport firm in like sort of the middle of Yorkshire with kind of essentially 40, 50-year-old men from, you know, sort of very rural bits of Yorkshire. It wasn't exactly the most welcoming place. And I remember that I've got a little piercing up here at the top of my ear and wanted to get it done. And my line manager just turned around and said, you will not get promoted if you do that, because your clients will not want to see that. They'll want to see someone that presents as, you know, cis male, kind of like straight acting, you know, and they don't want to see that. And I'm like, I was the maths person doing the geeky code at the back. And I was like, you know, I'm doing client work as well, but it's not like I'm the vital part. I mean, I'd like to think I was, I suppose, you know, from that perspective. So that was kind of one of the decisions why I decided to kind of go back into an academic life. So I applied for a PhD, and I had an offer from Sussex University, which is in Brighton, and one from Portsmouth. And obviously, instinctively, I wanted to go to Sussex because there's a really kind of vibrant gay life there. And you don't really hear about that about Portsmouth. But actually, when going to see the institutions, the Sussex department wasn't very open. It was kind of, you know, sort of people that were quite focused on work and nothing else. And when I went into Portsmouth one, there was a very kind of like sort of openly gay PhD student and openly lesbian PhD student. And they were just chatting away and kind of like sort of essentially having been themselves and living this really happy life while doing their PhD. So there was no choice in it for me after saying that. Like, I'm going to go to Portsmouth, you know, even though like sort of my kind of like life outside work may suffer because the scene isn't as big there. But where I spend a big chunk of my time, and it's going to be really important as I do a PhD, like they accept me for who I am. I could see that there, you know. So yeah, so kind of that directly influenced my PhD, you know. So there's, you know, and it's really nice once you got there. Like I ended up in a room, it was an astrophysics PhD that was just full of women and gay men, you know. It was extremely welcoming. Like you don't really see that in the physical sciences, you know. It was, you know, it was wonderful to kind of feel that inclusion. And sadly then, you know, research comes in, and that toxic masculine nature of kind of research kind of comes in. And I then felt excluded again. You know, I kind of felt that's not my style. I'm very empathetic. I like to listen. I love collaboration, which aren't traditionally seen as very masculine tendencies, which research favors. So that's why I've kind of ended up in engagement and research support. I kind of find that the person I am, like sort of, which is very much fundamental part of my sexuality and me, kind of are better suited for that in terms of that bringing in people and democratizing processes and things like that. So it's a little bit of kind of examples of kind of inclusion and exclusion, how they directly impacted my career. Essentially, it's there.
Yeah, and I think some not just relevant but powerful stories. And you actually made me recall my when I was choosing graduate schools, I had that same experience, and then I ended up choosing one that was just the better option, but also because I thought I'm going to feel more comfortable there and I'm going to be able to be myself. So interesting. And so thanks for sharing that. And Soreya, can I come to you, and what story do you want to tell?
I think the exclusion piece is, you know, not actually related to, you know, my sexuality or gender, but my ethnicity. And you know, working in a head of HR role previously, you know, being told, you know, your face doesn't fit, and being told it's, you know, for whatever reason, you know, being biracial, whatever, and you know, the sort of MD laughing it off, going, well, we hired you whatever you are, so we do believe in diversity. And you sort of go, oh yeah, this isn't for me. You know, it went on for sort of a good few years, and I, ended up actually having a breakdown. So, those statistics you show around mental health and well-being really, really personally resonate, which is why, I actively sought out an organisation where my education, my background, my ethnicity, were not a factor in me showing up as I truly am. That's why I'm very, very lucky I have landed at Enara, that, they happily welcome me with open arms and let me champion, this particular agenda, because it's so close to my heart that I don't feel anybody should have to experience in their work the type of exclusion or discrimination that I've experienced, in the early, not so distant past. And that's why, I'll always want to, work in organisations like Enara where, it doesn't matter who you are, it's the work that you do that matters and counts, and you will always be open, welcome with open arms for who you are, and we will celebrate that individual. So for me, I'm having that positive experience, and hopefully with the work that I do and the role that I do with the team that I work with, I'll be able to make sure I can pay that experience of inclusion forward.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about is a lot of times the genesis of why a lot of us do the work that we do. Rather, sometimes in our day jobs, others, on a volunteer basis, but it comes from a very personal place. But the thing I wanted to call out is what you're essentially talking about is intersectionality, both in terms of our experiences, so you don't identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community, but you can say, but I know that feeling. Yep. I know what it feels like to be excluded. And I think with that, a lot of times what we're talking about here, even though the focus is a particular area of dimension of diversity today, I think what we can all speak to is this idea of working toward the freedom of everyone. So why do we get involved? Why would I get involved in race and ethnicity conversations and that sort of thing? Is because it's not just about those people, it's about all of us. And so I think what you're bringing in is a story of allyship, and it's through this personal experience. I know how it feels. I know what it's like.
Yeah, so no, I think empathy is the key in this, and putting yourself in other people's shoes. And I think you might have a diverse organisation, but there's no inclusivity, or you might have an inclusive organisation, there's no diversity. And I think it's something we all have to think about and understand and educate ourselves on.
Yeah. So thanks for sharing that. And Anne, we're going to come to you now.
Oh, thanks, Jay. Well, look, I've had negative and positive to answer your question. You probably, if you're close to the camera, can see the wrinkles here. I'm going to be 69 on Saturday, in fact. So I've lived longer than certainly the rest of the panel, and maybe many of you who are participating today. I was born a white working class little girl in Moss Side in Manchester in 1953. I think my heart and my love for my parents always made me able to feel it was natural to be inclusive. But actually my experiences, and here's the negative, given the context I've just briefly outlined, is that really in reality I wasn't ever truly able to be myself, and certainly not once I went to even in the 70s when I went to university, and then not in the 80s when I started to teach in education. If you've all seen even if you didn't experience it, there's been a recent revival of what it was like to be in the UK in the 80s anyway. If you were lesbian or gay, bisexual, transsexual, whatever. It was a very different working environment, and I could, but I won't, spend all afternoon telling you of ways and mechanisms with which I covered things up, and yet tried to be truthful to myself. And indeed, I was hugely successful. I was the youngest further education college principal to be appointed ever, I think. Still, I was only 34 years old when I became principal of Milton Keynes College, but no way in 1986 could I say that actually at that point I met and have lived with since, the woman who's now my wife. So there's been a lot of not being able to be authentic. But the good thing and positive experience, as you're witnessing this today with this event, has come for me in the last decade, in the last 5 years. I'm working with younger people. I've been chair of the Scouts for the last 6 years. And actually, that's the largest mixed youth engagement charity in the UK, and indeed worldwide. It's a major movement. But just in the UK, the learning I have had from those young people, the inspiration I've got from them, I'm not very good at using the right words. And I should have said at the beginning, I might get them wrong because I didn't really know. Well, I still don't totally know what cisgender means, or I don't totally always use the right word to describe someone, but young people will tell me, and I want to know that, and I want to be able to be as they are, which I think the positive is that being who you are these days, and maybe being active, Jay, like you were saying, is much, much more accepted, much more possible, much more life enhancing, and really so good for all of us. It's unimaginable that that could have happened in my lifetime, even though, as we've said, there's still things to do. So the positive for me is being to live to this age, and it almost brings tears to my eyes, actually, to say it to you.
Amazing, thank you. And I know Anne, and we could spend another 2 hours just listening to her stories, and you would leave feeling incredibly inspired and probably emotional as well, just like Anne is demonstrating. And so thanks for all of you for sharing your stories. I'll just quickly share a couple of mine. And like everyone, I've had positive and negative. I think I just wanted to share a quick one that wasn't so positive, and it wasn't that long ago. And I went through this interview process, and sorry, my dog is downstairs barking. The joys of working at home, right? He was so quiet until now. But anyway, so you go through an interview process and you're like, I killed it. It's like I had that experience where I spoke with 5 different people, and every time I was like, I couldn't have done better. But in one of those interviews, I'm gonna just shut my door. Sorry. I'm so sorry. You saw a cat, I'm sure, out the window. Yeah, so through that process, there was one of the people that I spoke with where I am sensitive, and I was like, there's something happened during that interview where I talked about my husband in context, because he asked a question as part of it. And I was like, I just noticed there was something different. Anyway, the feedback is that you were amazing. It was down to you, one other person, and there really wasn't that much between you, and you were different in a good way, but that we just had to go with this other person because of this one sort of thing. And I was like, the reason why you went with her is because she was more like you. And this is my intuition and everything, and it's not something you necessarily can improve. But the part of the story that I wanted to share is what happened after that. So I was really speaking to a friend in HR, and I was really kind of upset about the process at the time. And I was explaining to her, I didn't really want to talk about it, but eventually she's like, you can talk to me, you can trust me, just tell me what's going on, because I can tell you're really upset about it. I was like, fine. I can't prove it or anything like that, but this is what I experienced. And my intuition is telling me that this is what unconscious bias and what we kind of talked about, and what Kenji Yoshino talks about. It wasn't overt, it was subtle, and eventually this is the end result. And her response is, well, maybe next time just don't come out in the interview. And I was like, oh, it took me a week really to get over that. And it was at that point where I was like, this is not the place for me. And that's a whole nother story. But it was that moment where I was like, wow, I didn't expect that, from somebody who's, he's super supportive, and I know her intention was really good. She just wanted me to do well. But I think, but yeah, so I think the positive though is because, like Anne was saying, I didn't grow up in a world where 40. Since then, that's been how I identified. And it's only been in the last couple of years that I've been really overt in my professional life, even though I've been out and open, just saying to people, my pronouns are they, them, and kind of reinforcing that. And we're in a place in our world right now where it's not completely accepted yet. But the positive is that when people use my pronouns correctly, and that happens professionally occasionally. I remember the first time that happened in an email. Somebody referred to me the way that I want to be referred to, and I was like, it really was touching. And I felt this is the team I want to be part of, and I felt respected and seen. And I think it's little things like that that make a big difference sometimes. So I just wanted to leave you all with that. And in fact, we're doing pretty good on time, so we definitely have time to go to this next question. And it's important really to kind of end here in a way, this discussion piece, before we come to open space. And I'm actually going to come to Soreya first. And what practical advice would you give to individuals, leaders, and organizations who want to be more LGBTQ+ inclusive?
I think educate yourselves. I think keep having the conversation, seeking out, forums like this. People are willing to talk and want to support you to make more inclusive environments. I think some really practical tips for maybe HR teams is don't be scared by the protected characteristics, think beyond those, because they tend to kind of restrict your thinking. One thing that we've done a lot of is think about having gender neutral contracts of employment, policies, job descriptions. So there's just some really practical things, but I think the first step is think beyond your protected characteristics and think about diversity and inclusion in a different way, and continue to educate yourselves and join forums and connect with people who will share their stories and support your organizations.
Wow. Really nice. Thank you for sharing that. And Anna, I'm going to come to you next. Any advice for those around the call?
Yeah, I was just also looking at one or two of the comments in the chat, picking up from what you just said about the experience you had, Jay, with that job. I think it's really quite important to find a way of, if you are being interviewed for something or considering going to an employer, of just being yourself and saying quite naturally, my wife or my husband, and then if they react in a particular way, just saying, no, that is not the sort of place I want to work, and telling them why, because that's again an example of this much more active way of giving feedback that people have to take notice of, and then they might set up and do something about it. I just want to say one of the huge benefits of getting older and getting in positions of power and influence is the joy of being able to use that to make the workplace the kind of employer that everybody and anybody wants to come and work in. And at City and Guilds, where I'm speaking from now in London, over the world, we have over 1,000 people that work with us, but a large number of them in the UK here. And we've really tried with the inclusion and diversity work we're doing to reach out to all aspects, so including neurodiversity, stuff on menopause. We've got 12 groups, I think it is, of employees engaged in telling us what makes them feel much more as if they belong in the workplace, and what we're not doing what we could do better so that they can bring their full selves to work. So just following on from Soreya, directors of HR are really crucial, or people in culture people it is, because it's about that now, are really critical in helping that and convincing the CEOs and the board that the culture has all those business benefits that you showed, but actually it just makes individuals who, employees and skills are at a premium now. We can't get people in this country post-Brexit and in the right roles and things, and therefore employers can't afford to be high and mighty about who they want working with them. And I just think we should push at that open door in terms of making the workplace over the next decade very much more naturally open to the joys as well as the challenges of all diversity.
Amazing. Thanks for that build. And finally, Dom, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things I'd add. One's kind of an immediate one is kind of don't be scared of using pronouns. So kind of either on your LinkedIn, your Twitter bios, the bottom of your Zoom screen, like it just kind of normalizes the praxis, which then is kind of really helps kind of your trans colleagues and kind of other colleagues, kind of like sort of non-binary colleagues as well. It's just, if everyone's doing it, then it doesn't kind of feel like we're being targeted. I was a part of an attack on Twitter just a couple of weeks ago because I had he/they on top of my Twitter feed, and they were like, he's one of those people. So just kind of normalize it as part of HR practice, you know, and as part of that as well, if you've got like a funding panel or an interview panel, don't assume, just kind of always use they until you know one way or another, kind of like whichever kind of pronouns they prefer, you know, if it's he, they, or she, you know, sort of never make assumptions based on names, and just kind of get used to that, kind of like sort of normalize that. So another thing I'd kind of mention is the importance of middle management and people who are running teams. Like sort of they're the ones, if you're kind of managing staff, make sure you've got time to manage them well. Like sort of, you know, I think it's something which always happens. Kind of we always got a million and one things. I mean, I think that's really important for people who are not represented in the majority of the workplace. They need to have a champion who understands them and listens to them and have empathy. And to be able to do that with your own team, you're going to be able to have time to get to know them and support them well, and be able to empower them to be able to use whatever HR systems are in place in your company. So if you are a line manager and you're finding yourself struggling, you know, sort of to keep up with your line management duties, do talk to your own management around it. It's something that you really need to kind of invest in, and in particular around staff who kind of are LGBT and kind of other things as well. And that's something I really learned recently when I myself became a line manager. I think it's the only thing you kind of realize when that happens. So, you know, and it definitely became acute over the pandemic where, you know, suddenly the importance of being human sort of came into fore in line management. So that's the second tip I'd give. If you are a manager, give yourself time to kind of be able to manage your team and support them.
Good. And Jazz, if we go to the next slide, it's just a summary from my perspective, just picking up on some of the things that have already been named, actually. One is around pronoun signatures, but it's really about the use of and the power of symbols, you know. So as Dom mentioned, that is really helpful, but also visual markers. So like rainbow lanyards and stuff are quite popular. Anything that you can say, because I tell you what, people in the LGBTQ community they pay attention, you know, from my own experience, but also just working with a lot of people in this area, you know, that we look for where is it safe to be ourselves. And the stories that came out today, you heard that, but often it's the symbols that we can display and use that help say that it is. The other one is around creating space to learn and tell stories, kind of like what we're doing here today. And anyone can do that, you know, so it's just about creating a safe space to, you know, just allow people to talk about their experiences, have workshops, you know, kind of like build on what you experienced here today, you know, where you can have people come in and kind of talk about their stories, and this idea of normalizing that Don brought in, about normalizing it's okay, you know, to talk about who you are and your experience. And if you don't have one, creating a network or finding one to join. Somebody asked in the comments, can biotechs join or be part of the Proud Science Lines? Yes, we're creating a way to do that. But also in the slides, you'll notice something called OutBio. And OutBio is specifically an organization for biotechs. Oftentimes, smaller companies aren't at the size where they can create internal networks yet. OutBio kind of is there for that reason. But certainly the Proud Science Lines is opening up so we can invite more people in as well. The other one is about being intentional, and what's often the case is you know, people are like, well, or I just heard stories of leaders who are like, you know, culture isn't really that important or something like that, but it's those same leaders that are creating culture whether they want to or not. And so my advice is always to be intentional about it. So you're creating culture and what it feels like to work here, whether you're intentional or not. So why not plan to be inclusive for all the reasons we were just talking about here today? And finally, I work a lot with leaders, and I'm not talking about those in title, but anyone who has the desire and, you know, the personal motivation, you know. And I think I talk about it in 3 dimensions. It's about being seen. So I'm not a natural kind of lead from the front kind of person, but at some point I needed to make a choice to say, well, nobody else was speaking up or being seen. And so at one point, a friend of mine, because I used to work at GSK, described me as the biggest gay at GSK. That was intentional. Not that that was what I intended to do, but simply that I knew it was important to be seen. And then also given the opportunity is to be brave and kind of be heard, you know, so your voice, everybody's voice matters just as much as anyone else's, you know, so your experience and that sort of thing is important. And if you talk about it, that's important. And then finally taking action, because one of the things I noticed too, a lot of times in this space is the easy thing to do is say, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. That's wrong, fix it, fix it, fix it. But it's also important to say, that's wrong, and this is what I think we can do differently. In fact, I've already started that work. So taking action. Hopefully that was helpful in terms of this tour around some of the data, but also storytelling, and hopefully some helpful advice about what you could potentially do. What we're going to do now is open up, and I know we've had questions come in already, and hopefully Jazz can help us a little bit with that. But we just wanted to create some open space. If you have questions or reflections, we're happy to hear it.
Super. So, I mean, actually, Elizabeth, I'm wondering whether you asked a question at the beginning. I don't know whether you wanted to come off and ask it to the panel, or I'm happy to read it out if you'd like.
Yeah, it's been absolutely wonderful hearing hearing from all the panel and what you've been sharing, and it's very inspirational. It was really just a little bitty question, because diversity, as Anne mentioned, includes things like neurodiversity as well, which I'm passionate about. So I was just curious whether that BCG figure, you know, what forms of diversity that included. Yeah.
There's a link into the slides that you'll get, so you can go and look. The reason why I say that is because there were 6 dimensions, and I can't name them. I can't remember specifically what they were, but they were across 6 dimensions that included something like gender, but also other things that you might not expect, like background, you know, things like that. So.
Oh, that'd be really interesting. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Jay.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, I'm just checking now if the other questions have come in. So there was one just about recruiting and onboarding, and how during the process, how you can be more, how you can demonstrate, I guess, that you are an inclusive company during that process. So I don't know if you guys have got any advice on that.
Yeah.
In addition to,
yeah, Soreya, and then I know, Dom, that you kind of mentioned this, but we'll come to you. But Soreya, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think the recruitment piece is, you know, really, really important for people to get an understanding of your culture, your diversity and inclusion initiatives to, you know, support that individual to show up as they are. And I think asking people, you know, what pronouns do they want to be referred to right at that get-go is really, really powerful, so that, you know, you've got an understanding of that individual and who they are. And I think, you know, starting with that initial piece is really crucial. You know, it's something that I've had to put into practice and had to learn to do, but actually it's become quite powerful across our organisation, you know, to ask people right from the get-go. Just that, you know, it's not simple, but it is kind of simple when you think about it.
Great. And Dom, you touched on this, I think, but anything you would add?
I was just to echo the bit I mentioned earlier about, you know, if you're a recruitment manager, be human. There's something that's intrinsically so inhuman about like an interview process, and it really doesn't represent any sort of future workspace that you're going to be working in. So kind of actively change that and challenge that. You know, in our case, you know, we send out a couple of questions beforehand that are more challenging questions, so that everyone has like an equal opportunity to get ready for that as well. You know, and just kind of at the start acknowledge that it's a bit of a weird situation, and just, you know, be yourself, be the person that you're going to be to that person once the job starts. And I kind of, you know, I've had some fantastic feedback sort of, you know, from candidates successful and unsuccessful, that they've been able to feel comfortable and actually represent themselves you know, sort of how best they could at the interview as a result of that. And if you do that at interview, they know you're going to be like that when you actually come to work, you know, sort of. So as a manager and as a recruitment manager, keep that in mind, you know, don't just kind of follow the same trends and the same style because it's the way that it's always been done. You know, that isn't necessarily the best way to do things.
Yeah, good. And would you add anything?
Well, it's a bit of a tangential point, but I'm just aware in the sort of 50 minutes we've spent together that perhaps what there's just an element missing of how much and how important it is to celebrate what has been achieved actually, and to keep on celebrating all that's good about all diversity, because that's a very safe and good way to get people, employers, individuals, families, young people engaged in things, and it gets out a different message from actually the still very strong prevalence that there is in human nature to try and be discriminatory in all sorts of ways. I mean, let's not hide away from the fact that because you see it on every day, but just thinking about and I'm not criticising them, but the people that were going after Keir Starmer the other day. It's so easy, isn't it, to just slip into really what are places of fear just because the other person from you has a different opinion or dresses differently or does things differently. And somehow, if we can find a way of creating a place where those fears and prejudices are held and then challenged appropriately and then ultimately celebrated, I think we will mature as a democracy and as a society. And I'm speaking just in the UK, because perhaps the other dimension we should bear in mind, given the importance globally of science and life science and the work that you're talking about, is there's so many countries where even just uttering the word gay or being homosexual it just is unconscionable. So there is that aspect of things too.
Yeah, great. And I think the final thing that I would add to as a layer is also just be conscious of what you may not, those doing interviews and kind of going through that process aren't yet comfortable with. And so I'll specifically talk about the British Science Association, who connected with the Proud Science Alliance because they wanted a specific workshop around gender identity and expression. And they said, currently we're not aware of anyone in our organization who's trans or under that umbrella, but we're conscious that there probably will be, and we want to be ready. So I think in that sense, they're building their capability, in anticipation of welcoming people who are trans or gender non-conforming into the organization. So just those considerations, within your organization across the dimensions of diversity, just being aware, but honest with yourself. Where do you want to become more aware and understand? So as you show up to interviews, then you can kind of lead with confidence. Yeah. Okay. So there's no other questions, and we're actually almost at time. So I wonder if now is a good place to wrap things up and pass back to you, Jazz, just to close this out and say what people can expect after this.
Definitely. Thanks, Jay, and thanks to our whole panel. I mean, you guys are really an inspiration, and yeah, I mean, I've learned so much from the session and feel really kind of inspired walking away from it. So I really hope that those of you who attended today also found it valuable. And thank you so much for all of your lovely comments and questions into the chat box. It's so nice to kind of have this like community and be a part of something like this. So yeah, I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody that has attended today, and I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. And in terms of follow-up, you will get the slides and a recording. So yeah, I hope you all have a lovely day.
Great, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.